A rainy night in a cabin. The rain had been falling since noon, soft at first, the kind of rain that seems almost apologetic, tapping gently on the windshield as if asking permission to fall harder. By the time Mira turned off the paved road and onto the gravel track that wound up through the pines, it had stopped apologizing altogether. It came down in long silver ropes, blurring the headlights into two smeared moons, and the wipers could barely keep pace, squeaking back and forth, a tired little rhythm that made her eyelids feel heavy before she'd even arrived. She drove slowly. The gravel had turned to mud in places, and the old car's tires slipped once, twice, finding their grip again with a soft shudder that traveled up through the steering wheel and into her hands. She didn't mind. There was nowhere else she needed to be, not tonight, not for the next several days, and the slowness of the drive felt like the first real exhale she'd taken in months. The cabin appeared the way it always did, suddenly, as though it had stepped out from behind the trees to meet her. It was a low, broad-shouldered thing, built of silvered logs and a steep tin roof that her grandfather had put on sometime in the 50s, and it sat in a clearing that always seemed a little smaller each time she returned, as though the forest were patient but insistent, closing in by inches. A single window glowed with the warm light of the lamp she had left on a timer, and beyond it the porch waited, dry and a little dusty, two rocking chairs facing out toward the trees, like old friends mid-conversation, paused. Mira parked as close to the steps as she could manage and sat for a moment with the engine off, listening. Rain on a car roof has its own particular music, layered and busy, hundreds of small percussion notes landing at once, and she let herself listen to it the way she used to as a child, pretending she could pick out individual raindrops from the crowd. She never could, that was the point. When she finally opened the door, the cold, wet air rushed in to meet her, smelling of soil and crushed pine needles, and the particular mineral sharpness that came just after the rain had properly settled in. She grabbed her bag from the passenger seat, pulled her jacket up over her head in a gesture that protected nothing at all, and ran for the porch, laughing at herself the whole short way, the way you laugh at rain when you're not truly cold, when you know a fire and dry socks are only minutes away. The porch boards were cool and slightly damp beneath her sneakers. She fumbled with the key, the same brass key that had opened this door for 3 generations, its edges worn soft and rounded by decades of hands, and the lock gave with its familiar reluctant click, half stuck, half welcoming, as if the house itself needed a moment to remember her. Inside, it smelled exactly the way she'd hoped, cedar and old paper, and the faint ash of fires long since gone cold. She stood in the doorway a moment, dripping onto the mat, and simply breathed it in. "Hello, house," she said quietly, because she always said it, because her grandmother always had, and some habits are less habits than they are quiet prayers. The cabin had one main room that did the work of 3, kitchen along the back wall, a sitting area with a deep-bellied stone fireplace, and in the far corner, behind a folding screen painted with faded cranes, a bed with a quilt so old and soft it had lost any memory of its original color, settling instead into a gentle dust rose gray. A narrow staircase led up to a sleeping loft that Mira rarely used anymore, not since she'd started coming here alone, preferring instead the low bed downstairs, where she could hear the fire crackle and watch its light move across the ceiling beams. She set her bag down by the door and did what she always did first, knelt by the fireplace and built a fire with the same unhurried care her grandfather had taught her, back when her hands had been too small to properly grip the hatchet and she'd only been allowed to arrange the kindling. Newspaper first, twisted into loose knots, then the thin, dry sticks leaned together like the frame of a tiny teepee. Then, once those caught, the split logs from the rack by the door, added one at a time, patient, unhurried, as the flames found their footing and began, at last, to breathe. The fire caught with a soft whoomph and a shower of orange sparks that rose and vanished up the flue, and Mira sat back on her heels, watching it settle into a steady burn, feeling the first real warmth of the evening reach her damp knees. Outside, the rain had not lessened. If anything, it seemed to be finding a rhythm now, an actual established beat rather than the scattered opening notes of before, drumming against the tin roof in long, unbroken waves that rose and fell like breathing. She loved that sound above almost any other. Rain on a tin roof was to her mind one of the world's few perfect noises, not too sharp, not too soft, endlessly varied yet endlessly the same, a sound that asked nothing of you except that you lie still and let it happen. She peeled off her damp jacket and hung it on the hook by the door, then her shoes, setting them by the fire to dry, toes pointed toward the flames like two small animals warming themselves. In her bag she found dry socks, thick wool ones her mother had knitted years ago in a cheerful, slightly uneven pattern of red and cream, and she pulled them on with the particular satisfaction reserved for dry socks after a wet drive. The kitchen, such as it was, held a small gas stove, a kettle gone soft and grey with age, and a cupboard of mismatched mugs collected over decades, some inherited, some bought at yard sales, one that had been a gift from a boyfriend so far in her past she could barely remember his face, though she remembered with strange clarity that he had liked his tea too sweet. She filled the kettle from the hand pump at the sink, working the handle with the specific squeak and groan rhythm the pump had always had, and set it on the stove to heat. While she waited, she moved through the cabin, lighting the lamps. Real oil lamps, most of them, their glass chimneys a little smoky from years of use, because though the cabin did have electricity now, run up on a line her uncle had insisted on installing a decade ago, Mira preferred the lamps on nights like this. Electric light felt too certain, too clean, when the whole point of a night like this was softness. Soft light, soft rain, soft edges on everything. By the time the kettle began its low, building whistle, the cabin had transformed. Firelight and lamplight mingled in warm pools across the wooden floor, throwing long, gentle shadows from the furniture, and the whole room seemed to have exhaled along with her, settling into itself the way old houses do when someone they know comes home. While the kettle finished its slow climb toward a whistle, Mira opened the little drawer beneath the lamp on the mantel, looking for a fresh box of matches, and found instead a photograph she didn't remember ever seeing before. It had slipped down behind the matchboxes at some point, forgotten, its edges gone soft and rounded the way old photographs go when they've been handled by many hands over many years. In it, a much younger version of her grandmother stood on this very porch in the rain, laughing, her hair plastered flat, one arm thrown up as if she'd just been caught mid-dash for the door. On the back, in pencil, someone had written only, "June, the year of the flood." Nothing more, no names, no explanation, just those 5 small words and a date circled twice. Mira timed it a few times, smiling faintly, trying to place that laugh against the quieter woman she knew only from stories. She propped it against the lamp's base, facing out into the room, deciding it belonged there now, and went back to waiting for her tea with the small, warm feeling of having found something she hadn't known she was looking for. She made her tea, chamomile with a spoon of honey stirred in slow circles, and carried the steaming mug to the window seat that looked out over the clearing. The glass was fogged at the edges, and beyond it the world had gone the deep blue-grey of a rainy dusk, the trees barely more than darker smudges against a darker sky, their shapes softened by the sheets of falling water between here and there. She pulled the old wool blanket from the back of the seat around her shoulders, tucked her sock feet beneath her, and simply watched the rain for a while, blowing gently across the surface of her tea, in no hurry at all. There is a particular kind of thinking that only happens during rain, a loose, unspooling sort of thought that doesn't follow any straight line, that drifts from memory to memory, the way the raindrops themselves drifted down the window glass, merging, splitting, finding new paths. Mira let her mind wander that way now, unhurried, tracing whatever threads it liked. She thought of her grandmother, who had built this cabin's rhythms long before Mira was born, who had, by all accounts, insisted on the window seat specifically over her husband's objections that it wasted good wall space that could hold shelves. A person needs somewhere to watch the weather from, her grandmother had apparently said, and that was the end of the argument, as most arguments with her grandmother tended to be. Mira never met her. She'd passed 2 years before Mira was born, but she felt her presence in this cabin more clearly than she felt the presence of people she saw every week. Perhaps that was what a house was, in the end, memory made solid enough to sit in. She thought of childhood summers here, when the cabin had been crowded with cousins, and the smell of insect repellent, and the particular chaos of 8 children under one roof during a storm, everyone talking over everyone else, someone always crying, someone always laughing, her grandfather in his chair by the fire, pretending to read but actually watching them all with an expression of amused, exhausted love. She thought of the year the creek had flooded and they'd all had to wade to the car in the morning shrieking at the cold water, and how her uncle had carried her on his shoulders the whole way, singing some nonsense song to keep her from being scared. She thought of quieter years later, the cabin emptying out as cousins grew up, got jobs, had children of their own who preferred hotels with pools, the rooms gone silent, one visit at a time, until eventually it was mostly just her, coming up alone or with a friend, finding a different kind of comfort in the emptiness than she'd found in the noise. Both were real. Both, she thought, were part of what it meant to love a place across an entire lifetime, the noise and the silence, the fullness and the emptying, all of it belonging to the same story. The rain outside seemed to agree, or at least it seemed to keep its own kind of time with her thoughts, swelling and easing, and somewhere out past the tree line, a distant roll of thunder moved through the valley, low and unhurried, more a suggestion of power than a demonstration of it. Mira counted automatically, the way she had as a child, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, though no flash of lightning had preceded it that she'd seen, and she gave up counting somewhere around 6, deciding the storm was still busy elsewhere, content for now to send only its voice ahead. She sipped her tea. It had cooled to the perfect drinking temperature, and she let herself feel entirely, uncomplicatedly grateful for the mug warm between her palms, for the fire crackling steadily behind her, for the fact that tomorrow held no obligations at all. No meetings, no messages that needed answering, nothing but the woods and the rain and whatever she felt like doing with her hours. It had been a long time since she'd felt time stretch out like that, generous and unclaimed. Hunger arrived the way it does after a long drive, suddenly and with some insistence, and Mira uncurled herself from the window seat with the particular reluctance of someone leaving a very good spot, padding across to the kitchen in her red and cream socks. She hadn't brought much, preferring to keep the cabin's larder simple: a loaf of dense seeded bread, a wedge of good cheese wrapped in wax paper, a jar of soup her mother had insisted on sending along, homemade and rich with barley and root vegetables, exactly the kind of soup for a night like this. She set the jar in a pot of water to warm slowly on the stove, low heat, no rush, and cut thick slices from the bread while she waited, arranging them near the fire on a wire rack so they'd toast slowly, taking on that faint, smoky char that only fire-toasted bread ever really achieved. Reaching for a chipped saucer to catch the butter, she pulled down the squat, flour-dusted cookbook that lived on the shelf above the stove, its cloth cover gone soft and colorless with age, and a small card slipped out from between the pages and drifted to the floor. She bent to retrieve it and found a recipe in her grandmother's familiar slanted hand, titled simply Rainy Night Soup. The ingredients listed in a careful column, the instructions brief and confident in the way of someone who had made a thing so many times she no longer needed to explain it fully to herself. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, a single line had been added in a different, fainter ink. Good for the nights the rain won't stop. Serve to whoever is glad to be inside. Mira read it twice, smiling, before tucking the card back between the same two pages, marking the spot with a fold of wax paper so it wouldn't slip loose again. She hadn't made that particular soup tonight. Her mother's jar had already claimed that role, but she decided she would make it soon, some rainy evening still to come, using the same careful column of ingredients her grandmother had once measured out in this same small kitchen. While the soup warmed, she wandered the room collecting the small tasks that made a cabin feel inhabited rather than merely visited. She wound the old mantel clock, its key kept always in the same chipped saucer beside it, and listened to its tick settle into its unhurried rhythm. She fluffed the cushions on the two armchairs facing the fire, angled just so, the way her grandfather always claimed was for conversation, though in practice they mostly just faced the flames in companionable silence. She set fresh candles in the two brass holders on the table, though she didn't light them yet, saving that small ceremony for later, for full dark. The soup, when it was ready, tasted like exactly what it was, a mother's love translated into barley and thyme, and Mira ate slowly at the little table by the window, watching the rain-blurred dark outside while the toasted bread went soft with butter in her hand. Somewhere in the walls, the old cabin creaked and settled, the particular sound of aged wood contracting in the damp cool of evening, a sound she'd long ago found not eerie, but instead had come to find almost companionable, like the house clearing its throat before speaking. By the time she'd finished, full and warm in the particular way that only a simple hot meal after a long drive can make a person feel, the last of the daylight had drained entirely from the sky. The window had become a mirror, throwing back the room's own soft light rather than showing her anything beyond it, and the rain against the glass sounded, if anything, even closer now, more intimate, as though the storm had drawn its chair up nearer to listen in on her thoughts. She washed her single bowl and mug at the hand pump,
the water running cold and clean over her fingers, and set them to dry on the rack. Then she went around the room, lighting the candles she'd set out earlier, touching the match to each wick in turn, and watching the small flames steady themselves, doubling the room's light, doubling its warmth, until the whole cabin glowed like the inside of a lantern.
She added another log to the fire, sat back in one of the armchairs, the left one, always the left one, some habits outliving any memory of why they'd started, and let herself simply exist there for a while, full and warm and dry, listening to the rain, watching the flames, feeling her own eyelids grow pleasantly, gradually heavier. It was her grandfather's habit, and now hers, to read a little each night before sleep, and the cabin's single bookshelf held a peculiar and much-loved collection built up over 60 years of family visits, paperback mysteries with cracked spines, a few waterlogged field guides to local birds and mushrooms, a battered atlas whose borders no longer matched any current map, and on the bottom shelf, a row of hand-bound journals that Mira had never quite worked up the courage to read all the way through. Tonight, though, with the fire settled into its low, steady glow and the rain still falling in that same unhurried rhythm, she found her hand reaching for one of the journals instead of the usual mystery novel. It was one of her grandmother's, its cover soft brown leather gone dark and supple with age, a faded ribbon marking a page perhaps a third of the way through. She carried it back to the armchair, tucked her feet up beneath her, and opened it carefully, the way one might open a door to a room that had been shut for a long time. The handwriting was small and slanted and utterly familiar, though Mira had only ever seen it on the backs of old photographs and in birthday cards saved in a shoebox. She read slowly, partly out of respect, and partly because the light was low, and partly, she suspected, because some part of her wanted this particular reading to last. June the 3rd, the entry began. Rain again today, the good kind, the kind that soaks in instead of running off. William complained about the garden, but she noticed he stood out on the porch for a full 20 minutes just watching it come down, so her guess was his heart wasn't really in the complaining. The children were all asleep now, even the baby, worn out from chasing each other around the porch, pretending the rain was a monster they had to outrun. She had sat up a while longer than she meant to, just listening, deciding there was nothing in the world quite like the sound of a full house sleeping soundly through a storm, and that it was, she thought, as close to peace as this life offered. Mira paused there, feeling something warm and slightly sad settle in her chest, the particular ache of recognizing your own thoughts in the handwriting of someone who died before you were born, the strange comfort of realizing a feeling has been felt before, in this exact room, during this exact kind of rain. She read on, entry after entry, most of them small and unremarkable in the way that daily life mostly is. Notes about the garden, about visits from neighbors long since moved away or passed on, about small repairs to the cabin that Mira recognized even now, the same creaking step, the same stubborn window latch. But scattered among the ordinary entries were other ones, brief and luminous, moments her grandmother had apparently felt were worth setting down permanently. The first time she'd seen the northern lights from the clearing, faint green ribbons the children swore were dancing ghosts, the night a doe and her fawn had sheltered on the porch during a summer storm, so close through the window that she could see the fawn's spotted coat trembling with each roll of thunder. A long entry about grief, written the winter her own mother died, that Mira read twice, slowly, feeling the words settle into her like sediment.
Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the tin roof, and somewhere in that sound, Mira thought she could hear an echo of every other rain that had ever fallen on this particular roof, every storm her grandmother had sat through in this exact chair, every generation of tired, rain-soaked family members who had climbed these same steps and found the same warmth waiting inside. She read until her eyes grew heavy enough that the small, slanted handwriting began to blur pleasantly at the edges, and then she carefully marked her place, not with the original ribbon, which she left undisturbed further back, but with a slip of paper from her own bag, and set the journal gently on the side table, promising herself, and perhaps some quieter part of her grandmother, that she would return to it tomorrow. Sometime while she'd been reading, the storm had grown teeth. Mira noticed it first as a change in the rhythm of the rain, the steady percussion giving way to something more urgent, gusts of wind driving the rain sideways in long silver sheets that she could see even through the fogged glass, catching the light from the candles in brief, glittering flashes before vanishing into the dark. The old cabin's windows rattled faintly in their frames, an old familiar sound, and somewhere outside, a loose shutter, the one on the shed, always the shed, no matter how many times someone fixed it, began its irregular clatter against the wall. A proper flash of lightning lit the clearing then, bright enough to throw the trees into sharp, momentary silhouette, and this time the thunder that followed arrived close on its heels, a deep rolling boom that Mira felt as much as heard, a vibration that travelled up through the floorboards and into the soles of her feet. She counted without meaning to before the sound had even finished rolling away into the hills.
She should have felt afraid, perhaps, alone as she was in an old wooden building at the edge of a dark forest during a genuine storm. But instead she found herself smiling, pulling the blanket a little tighter around her shoulders, feeling something closer to delight than fear. There is a particular safety in being warm and dry while something large and wild happens just outside the walls, a safety that only means anything because of the wildness, because the storm is real and the walls are thin, and yet still somehow everything holds. She got up to check the fire, added another log, though it hardly needed one, mostly for the small satisfaction of watching the flames leap up to meet the fresh wood, sparks rising in a brief golden shower before settling again into their steady glow. She checked the windows, more from habit than actual worry. They had weathered worse storms than this cabin over the decades, and the small give in their old frames was more character than danger. She peered out at the shed's clattering shutter and decided, not for the first time, that she would fix it properly in the morning, when the light was better and the rain had eased, and that for tonight it would simply have to clatter, one more voice in the storm's chorus. The wind found a gap somewhere in the eaves and began to sing through it, a low, breathy note that rose and fell with each gust, and Mira stood a moment in the middle of the room, just listening to the whole assembled sound of it, rain and wind and distant thunder, and the shed's stubborn shutter, and the wind's thin whistling note, and beneath all of it, the low crackle of her own fire, holding its ground against the noise outside. It occurred to her that this was, in its way, a kind of music, and that she had never once in her life heard it and felt anything but comforted. She drew the curtains at last, not because she needed to shut out the storm, but because there was something particularly cozy about the gesture itself, the deliberate closing in of a small warm space against a large wild night, and settled back into her armchair with the sense of a person battening down for a long good sleep.
There is an art to preparing for sleep on a night like this, and Mira, over years of practice, had come to know its steps by heart. First, she banked the fire properly, arranging the logs so they would burn slow and low through the night rather than blazing bright and dying early, leaving a bed of coals that would still be faintly warm come morning. She set the fire screen in place, its old iron scrollwork throwing delicate moving shadows across the floor as the flame light shifted behind it. Then she moved through the cabin, blowing out the candles one by one, watching each small flame gutter and vanish, the room dimming by degrees until only the fire's low glow and a single oil lamp by the bed remained. She liked this part especially, the way a room seemed to grow quieter as it grew darker, as though light itself carried some of the day's noise, and extinguishing it let a different, softer kind of silence settle in. She changed into the flannel pajamas she kept folded in the cabin's dresser specifically for this purpose, worn soft from years of exactly these nights, and pulled a heavier second pair of socks over the wool one she already wore, because the floor near the bed always ran a few degrees colder than the rest of the room, an old quirk of the foundation. She brushed her teeth at the small basin, the cold water bracing against her warm skin, and studied her own tired, candle-lit face in the spotted little mirror above it for a moment, thinking, as she often did in this cabin, that she looked more like her grandmother here than she did anywhere else. Something about the low, warm light, perhaps, or something about the particular tiredness this place always drew out of her, an unclenching that showed in the eyes. Back in the main room, she pulled the quilt down on the bed, the dust rose one, soft with age, and set a second, heavier blanket at the foot in case the night turned colder, which, judging by the wind's rising pitch outside, it well might. She fetched a glass of water from the pump and set it on the small table beside the bed, alongside the oil lamp, its wick trimmed low, casting a small warm circle of light rather than any real brightness. She thought briefly of checking her phone, a habit so deeply worn into her that her thumb had almost half reached for her bag before she caught herself, and then remembered with a small private satisfaction that she had left it in the car on purpose, that there was no signal up here regardless, that for the next several days the only news she would receive would be whatever the forest chose to tell her. She let her hand fall back to her side and felt lighter for it. Instead, she climbed into bed, propped herself against the pillows, and let herself simply listen for a while to the rain, softened now by the drawn curtains, but no less present, and to the fire's low crackle, and to the old mantel clock's patient tick, and her own breathing, slowing now, falling into rhythm with all the rest of it.
She thought she might read a little more of the mystery novel from the shelf, the one she'd actually intended to read tonight before her grandmother's journal had claimed her attention instead. And when she picked it up, a single loose page slipped out from between its pages and landed softly on the quilt. Curiously, it was not part of the novel at all. It was a page torn from another of the journals, in the same slanted hand, undated, tucked there so long ago that the crease had gone soft and pale. "If you are reading this," it began, "it is probably raining, because that is the only time anyone in this family ever actually opens a book." Mira laughed quietly into the dim room, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the rain outside, and read the rest, a short, funny complaint about her grandfather's snoring, and beneath it, in the same fond tone, a small note that the rain that night had been the loudest she'd ever heard, and that she hadn't minded one bit. She set the page on the side table, propped against the oil lamp, meaning to return it to its journal in the morning, and found her eyes were already closing before she'd opened the novel's cover after all. She didn't mind. There would be other nights, other pages. There always were in a cabin like this. The mind does a curious thing on the edge of sleep, especially on a night full of rain. It stops sorting so carefully between what is remembered and what is imagined, and lets the two drift together into something softer than either. Mira lay with her eyes closed, not quite asleep, and found her thoughts moving without her steering them, the way a small boat moves once you've stopped rowing, carried along by whatever current happens to be running beneath it. She thought she heard, very faintly beneath the rain, the sound of her grandmother's voice, not words exactly, just the warm, unhurried tone of someone telling a long, familiar story to a room full of drowsy children, the cadence used only for bedtime. She thought of the deer that had sheltered on this porch generations ago, its fawn trembling at the thunder, and in her half-dream she saw them clearly, standing just beyond the drawn curtains, patient and quiet, waiting out the storm the way she was waiting it out herself, each of them safe in their own particular way. She thought perhaps she should get up and check, just to be sure there wasn't really a deer out there tonight, needing shelter, and then she remembered, in the loose logic of half-sleep, that it didn't matter whether there was, because the cabin would welcome it regardless, the way it welcomed everyone who came into it from the rain. The wind sang its thin note through the eaves, and in her drifting mind it became, briefly, the sound of the kettle, and she thought muzzily that she ought to get up and take it off before it woke the house, before remembering that the kettle had long since been washed and put away, that the sound was only wind, only rain, only the storm settling in for its own long night, the same as she was settling in for hers. Somewhere in the walls, the old cabin creaked its familiar creak, clearing its throat, saying nothing, and Mira felt herself smile faintly in the dark, eyes still closed, feeling entirely, weightlessly safe. She thought of tomorrow only briefly, and only in the vaguest terms, the shed's shutter waiting to be fixed, the mushrooms that might have come up overnight along the tree line, worth a slow morning walk to check, the rest of her grandmother's journal waiting patiently on the side table for her to return to it. None of it felt urgent, none of it pulled at her the way tasks so often did in her ordinary life, demanding attention, demanding speed. Here, everything could simply wait its turn, unhurried, the way the rain was unhurried, the way the fire's last coals were unhurried in their slow fade toward morning. The rain went on, the wind went on, the old cabin held the way it had held through this storm and every storm before it, and somewhere beneath all that steady sound, Mira's breathing slowed further still and further, until it too had settled into the storm's own patient rhythm, indistinguishable from the rest. Later, though later meant very little in a night like this, stretched and formless as it was, the fire burned down to a soft bed of embers, orange going slowly to grey at the edges, still throwing enough warmth to keep the room from ever growing properly cold. The oil lamp on the side table had guttered low, its flame reduced to the smallest steady point of gold, casting barely more light now than a single patient star. Outside, the storm had begun almost imperceptibly to ease. The wind's urgent gusts settled into longer, gentler breaths, and the rain's hard percussion softened by degrees to something closer to its earlier rhythm, steady, unbroken, but no longer urgent, no longer insistent, as though the storm itself had grown tired.
The shed's shutter clattered less often now, its irregular rhythm growing sparser, and somewhere far off the thunder had moved on entirely, carrying its low voice away into some other valley, some other night. Mira slept the particular deep, dreamless sleep that only comes after a long drive and a hot meal and an old journal read by firelight. The kind of sleep the body simply surrenders to, without negotiation, without the usual restless surfacing that so often interrupted her nights at home. Her breathing was slow and even, one hand curled loosely near her face on the pillow, the dust rose quilt drawn up to her chin, the heavier blanket she'd set aside, now barely needed, the fire's banked coals doing their quiet, faithful work through the small hours. If she dreamed, the dreams left no mark on her sleeping face, no furrow of worry, no small restless movement, only the occasional soft exhale, the occasional shift of a shoulder settling deeper into the pillow, the unmistakable stillness of someone entirely, thoroughly at rest. The cabin, for its part, seemed to settle too. Its old wood ceased its creaking as the temperature steadied through the deepest part of the night, and even the mantel clock's tick seemed to soften. Or perhaps it was only that there was nothing left awake to notice it very closely. The candles, long since extinguished, left only the faint memory of their scent in the air, beeswax and a little smoke, mingling with the wood smoke from the fire and the cool, rain-washed air that found its way in through whatever small gaps the old cabin had never quite managed to seal. Gaps that let in not cold exactly on a night like this, but simply the forest's own breath, slow and patient and vast. Outside, the clearing lay soaked and silvered under a sky still layered with cloud, no moon visible, no stars, only the deep textured dark of a world thoroughly rained upon, glistening faintly where the last porch light reached the wet grass and the bowed pines around the small sleeping house. Somewhere out past the tree line, a solitary owl called once, low and unhurried, and received no answer, and did not seem to mind, settling itself into its own long wait for morning. Toward dawn, the rain thinned to something barely more than mist, a fine grey veil drifting between the trees rather than falling from them, and the light that crept into the clearing came the colour of a dove's wing, pale and soft-edged, unhurried in the way all light seems to be after a long night of storm. Mira woke slowly, the way she always did in this cabin, without an alarm, without any sharp edge to the transition, simply drifting up out of sleep the way she drifted down into it, layer by gentle layer. For a while she lay still beneath the dust-rose quilt, listening to the hush that had replaced the night's noise. No more wind in the eaves, no more thunder rolling through the valley, only the faint, companionable patter of the last light rain against the window, and beneath it, somewhere close, the small, industrious chatter of a bird that had apparently decided the storm was over long before the sky had quite agreed. The fire had burned down to a pale bed of ash overnight, still faintly warm when she rose and knelt beside it, but no longer glowing, its work done for one night. She did not rush to rebuild it. There was something pleasant in the mild morning chill, a reminder that she had been warm enough through the night despite it. She pulled on her sweater over her flannel pajamas, pushed her feet into the boots by the door, and stepped out onto the porch to see what the storm had left behind.
The clearing looked washed clean, every surface beaded with water, the grass bent low and glittering in the pale early light, the gravel path dark and glossy where the mud had begun to firm up again. The pines stood dripping and patient, their needles releasing occasional fat drops that fell in soft, isolated ticks onto the porch roof. The air smelled the way it always did after a long rain, moss and wet bark, and somewhere beneath it the first hint of a distant cooking fire down the valley. The shed's shutter hung crooked but quiet now, its night of clattering apparently spent, and Mira made a small mental note, unhurried, to fix it properly sometime today, though the urgency of the night's promise had softened considerably in the morning light, the way most urgent things do once the sun, however pale, comes back up. She stood on the porch for a while longer, wrapped in her sweater, breathing the washed air, watching the mist thread its way between the pines. A single bird, small and brown and busy, hopped along the porch railing, pecking at something invisible in the wood grain before flitting off. It landed on the low branch just past the steps and began to sing, a short, bright, looping phrase, repeated 3 times. Mira stood very still and listened until it finished and flew off toward the tree line, and only then realized she'd been holding her breath, smiling. Behind her, through the open door, she could hear the cabin settling into its own version of morning, the particular quiet of a room that had held someone safely through a storm, and now simply waited, patient as ever for whatever came next. She thought of the kettle and the last of yesterday's bread, and her grandmother's journal waiting on the side table, its ribbons still marking the place she had left it, patient too, in no hurry at all. She thought, standing there in the soft grey morning with the last of the rain ticking gently off the pines, that this was precisely the kind of morning her grandmother had written about. Not dramatic, not eventful, simply full, in its quiet way, of everything that mattered. The storm had come, and the cabin had held, and she had slept the whole night through without once waking to check whether it would hold. That, she thought, turning back toward the door, and the fire that wanted rebuilding, and the tea that wanted making, that was really all any night asked of a person. To arrive tired, to be warm enough, to listen to the rain until the listening itself became a kind of rest, and then in its own good time to wake into a morning that had been washed entirely clean, ready, unhurried, for whatever quiet thing came next. She went inside and closed the door gently behind her against the last of the mist, and began without any hurry at all to build the morning's first small fire.